The notebook was already open when I walked into the kitchen. My mother was sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The back door stood open behind her, letting the freezing October air drift into the house. She looked at me with a calmness I hadn't seen in months. "It's asking again," she said. I frowned. "What is?" She slowly pushed the notebook across the table. "Come here." I looked down at the page. A single blank line waited beneath the last name. The pen beside it had already been uncapped. "I can't write anymore," she whispered. "My hand won't stay steady." She glanced toward the greenhouse. Through the open doorway, I could see its fogged glass glowing faintly in the darkness. Something moved behind one of the panes. Not quickly, just enough that I couldn't convince myself it was only a reflection. My mother never looked away from it. "When the greenhouse gives you the next name," she said, "you have to write it." I laughed, not because it was funny, because taking her seriously felt impossible. It sounded exactly like the kind of thing dementia makes people believe. "If you don't," she continued, "it won't take the one it asked for. It'll take the nearest one instead." I remember thinking that was the saddest sentence I'd ever heard my mother say. I didn't know then that within a few months I'd be sitting in that exact chair, holding that same pen, trying to decide whether someone I'd never met was worth more than my own life. But none of that makes sense unless I start where this really began. My mother started leaving the back door open in October. The open back door was the first thing. She'd never been careless about the house. My father had been a fussy man about locks and drafts and heating bills, and even after he died, she kept his habits. The door bolted after dark. The thermostat watched like a hawk. So when I came down one morning that first week and found the back door standing open onto the cold garden, I assumed it was the memory thing, the disease doing what it does. I closed it. I mentioned it to her gently over breakfast, the way the pamphlets tell you to, no scolding, just a soft reminder. And she looked at me with a clarity that I hadn't seen in weeks, and said, "I have to keep it warm for them. They get cold otherwise." I asked her, "Keep warm? Keep who is warm?" And she said, "The greenhouse," like it was obvious, and went back to her toast. The greenhouse wasn't much to look at anymore. It was an old Victorian glass house my grandfather had built decades earlier, tucked against the back wall of the property. When I was a boy, it had been alive with tomatoes, orchids, damp soil, and warm air thick enough to fog your glasses. My mother loved that place. I still remember seeing her kneeling in the dirt while my father stood at the door complaining about the heating bill. But all of that belonged to another lifetime. By the time I moved back home, the greenhouse was dead. The glass was stained with years of grime. Half the panes were cracked. The flower beds had turned to dry earth. The heating pipes that once ran beneath the floor had been disconnected long ago. Nothing had grown there since before my father became ill. So when she said she had to keep it warm for them, I reached for the obvious explanation. The disease? It made perfect sense. A woman who had spent the happiest years of her life inside that greenhouse was simply reaching back to the last place that still felt familiar. It was sad. It was heartbreaking. And most importantly, it was completely explainable. That's the part that still haunts me. Every single step had an ordinary explanation. Until one day, it didn't. I went out to look at the greenhouse that afternoon, mostly so I could tell my sister I'd checked. And the first thing I noticed, standing in the cold garden with my breath showing, was that it was warm. Not warm like a sunny day warms glass. It was a raw gray afternoon, no sun, and the air around the greenhouse had a temperature to it, a softness, the way the air feels near a vent. I put my hand on the iron frame, and it wasn't cold the way everything else was cold. There was heat coming off it. Inside, through the dirty glass, I could see the dead beds, the old terracotta pots, the rusted heating pipes my grandfather had run along the floor, pipes that hadn't been connected to anything in years. There was no boiler. There was no power out there. The line had been cut when my father stopped paying to maintain it. There was no source for the heat, but the greenhouse was warm, and the door my mother insisted on keeping open let that warmth seep out into the garden in a thin, exhaled breath. I told myself it was decomposition. Compost generates heat. I knew that much. The old beds were full of rotted matter, and maybe something in there was breaking down and throwing off warmth. Some biological process. It was a reach even as I thought it. But it was a reach toward the ordinary. And that's the direction I always reached. I went back inside, and I closed the back door because it was freezing, and the heating bill was my problem now. And I told my mother the greenhouse was fine, and she got agitated in the way she did. And I opened the door again to calm her, and that was that. We kept the door open. It became one of the small accommodations you make for a person whose mind is leaving. Like leaving a light on. Like not correcting her when she called me by my father's name. I should tell you about the names, because that's the center of it. And I've been circling. A few days after the door, I was helping my mother sort through a box of my father's things, which she liked to do, going through his papers and tools, a way of being near him. And in the box, under his reading glasses and a folded handkerchief, there was a notebook, a cheap one, the kind you buy at a pharmacy, with a marbled cover gone soft at the corners. I opened it, expecting his handwriting, his careful engineer's print. Instead, it was my mother's hand, her loops and slants, and it was a list of names, dozens of them, down the page, each with a date beside it. Some of the names I knew. My grandmother, my father's brother, who died before I was born, a woman named Edith, who I vaguely remembered as a neighbor from my childhood. Most of them I didn't recognize at all. And the dates ran back decades, the oldest in faded pencil, the newest in fresh blue ink, and the newest date was from that very week. I asked her about it, holding the notebook open. And she got that clarity again, the frightening, lucid clarity that came and went, and she said, "That's the list of who it keeps warm. You add the next name when it's time. My mother kept it, and her mother before her. Now it's mine. After me, it'll be yours or your sister's. But she's no good with it. She won't do it right." She tapped the page. "You have to log the next name when the greenhouse tells you. If you let it go cold, they all come back at once, and you don't want that. You keep it warm, and you log the next name, and they stay where they are, warm, asleep. That's the whole of it. That's all I've ever had to do." I want you to understand that my mother, at that moment, did not sound confused. She sounded like a woman explaining a chore she'd done her whole life, the way she might explain how to bleed the radiators or when to bring the geraniums in. It was the disease, I told myself. The disease builds these narratives, these confabulations, whole systems of false memory that feel utterly real to the person inside them. I'd read about it. A person with this illness can construct an entire logic, internally consistent, and defend it with total conviction. And there's no use arguing because to them, it's simply true. The names in the notebook were real, of course, dead relatives and neighbors, the dead she'd accumulated over a long life. And her failing mind had woven them into a story about the greenhouse and the warmth. A story that gave her a job to do, a reason to keep the door open, a thread of purpose in the unraveling. It was almost beautiful in a way, that the mind would do that. That's what I told myself, holding the notebook, looking at the fresh blue date from that week beside a name I didn't know. A name that read, in her clear hand, Maren Adler. I closed the notebook and put it back in the box, and I didn't think about Maren Adler again for 3 days, until my sister called to tell me that a woman named Maren Adler had died. Before I go any further, I want to be honest about something. This isn't a story about a haunted building or a lonely man trapped in an impossible place. That would be easier to tell. The truth is far less convenient. It happened in my mother's house, in broad daylight as often as in darkness. My sister called every other day. Neighbors waved from their gardens. Life went on exactly as normal while something impossible settled quietly into the middle of it. Maybe that's why none of us saw it for what it was until it was already too late. Looking back, this is the point where everything could still be explained. Maren Adler wasn't a stranger. She'd lived 3 houses down for decades. She'd been ill for a long time. The neighbors already knew the end was coming. I was the only one who didn't. I'd only recently moved back. So when my sister called and quietly said, "Maren passed yesterday," my mind immediately found somewhere safe to stand. Of course, my mother must have known. She'd heard the conversations, seen the visitors. She'd watched the ambulance come and go. She simply wrote the name down a few days too early. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. Just an old woman with a failing memory trying to make sense of the world. It was the perfect explanation. And I accepted it without questioning a single part of it. A sick old woman 3 doors down was dying. And my mother, who loved her and whose mind was unspooling, had folded that knowledge into her greenhouse story. The name went in the book before the death, but only by days, and only because everyone knew it was coming. That explanation held. For weeks, maybe even longer than it should have. Looking back, I think that's how the greenhouse survives. It never demands belief. It never asks you to accept the impossible. It only asks you to choose the ordinary explanation. Again and again, until the ordinary is the only thing you're willing to believe. The greenhouse got warmer after Maren Adler died. I noticed it the morning my sister called. I went out to the garden with my coffee, needing air, and the warmth around the glass house was stronger than it had been. A genuine heat now, enough that the frost had melted in a ring around the structure while the rest of the garden stayed white. I stood in that ring of thawed grass with my coffee steaming, and I told myself it was the weather. A warm front, except it wasn't. The air everywhere else was freezing. I told myself it was the compost. I went and put my hand on the glass, and it was warm as a living body. And inside, through the grime, the dead beds were exactly as dead as before. The disconnected pipes exactly as disconnected. And there was no source. There was never any source. And I took my hand off the glass and went inside and did not finish my coffee. The routine that built up over that winter is the thing I'm most ashamed of. Because a routine is a kind of acceptance, and I accepted it long before I admitted I had. Every morning I'd check the back door was open. If my mother had a bad night and I'd closed it, I'd find her up before dawn, opening it, distressed, and I learned to just leave it. Every morning, I'd feel the temperature of the garden and know, without wanting to know, the state of the greenhouse, warm or warmer. I started, around December, going out to actually look inside, which I'd avoided. The door of the greenhouse itself was rusted half open, and I'd stand in the gap and look at the dead beds and the warm pipes, and I'd feel the heat on my face, and I'd listen because by December I'd started to feel like there was something to listen for, though there never was. Just the tick of the old iron expanding in the heat and the wind in the cracked panes. My mother got worse through the winter, the way they do, and better in flashes, and in the flashes, she'd talk about the greenhouse with that terrible clarity. She told me things I wrote off and have never been able to fully write off since. She told me her own mother had logged the name of a child who drowned in the reservoir the summer of 1950-something, and that the greenhouse had run hot for a month after, so hot the orchids bloomed out of season, and that her mother said the young ones always burned hottest. She told me you never log a name until the greenhouse asks, that you'll know because the warmth changes. It gets restless. It pulls toward the door. And that's the greenhouse telling you it's making room. And you find out who within a few days, and you write it down. And it settles. She told me once, holding my wrist hard, "Don't ever let it go cold. Your father let it go cold the winter before he died. He turned the heat off out of spite over the bills. And that's when he got sick. You keep it warm. Promise me you'll keep it warm." I promised her, "You promise a dying person whatever they need to hear." But I remember the date she said that, because it was the same week I found the second notebook. I'd been clearing the attic, partly to keep busy, partly because my sister and I had started the awful background process of thinking about what came after, when the house would be sold and emptied. And in the attic, in a trunk of my grandmother's things, there was another notebook, older, the cover cloth instead of marbled. And it was the same list in an older hand, names and dates running back further into the 1940s, the 30s. And below that in the trunk, another, older still, the paper foxed and brittle, named in fountain pen, dates from before the First War. 3 generations of the same list. The same job, my mother had said, handed down. You add the next name when the greenhouse tells you. My grandmother's, her mother's, and now my mother's. And after her, the notebook implied, mine. I sat in the cold attic with the 3 notebooks in my lap, and I did the thing I'd been avoiding, which was to read them as a record rather than a symptom. And read as a record, they were unsettling in a specific way I hadn't expected. Because if these were just the confabulations of 3 generations of declining women, you'd expect them to be lists of family and friends, the dead each woman had known. And they mostly were, but not entirely. Scattered through all 3 notebooks were names with dates, but no apparent connection. Names that didn't read like relatives or neighbors. And beside a handful of those, in the margin, a small notation. A word, the same word, in each generation's different hand. The word was stranger. In my grandmother's notebook, beside a name I didn't know, dated 1951. Stranger. In her mother's, beside another unknown name, 1929. Stranger. And in my mother's, the most recent notebook, 3 pages before Marin Adler, beside a name I didn't recognize, dated about 2 years ago, before I moved home. Stranger. I asked my mother about the strangers. I picked one of her good afternoons and I sat with her, and I showed her the name from 2 years back, the one marked stranger in her own hand, and I asked her who it was. And she looked at it for a long time, and the clarity came over her. And she said, "That's one I didn't know. Most of them, you know. Most of them are ours, the family, the street, the ones who'd have died anyway, and the greenhouse just keeps them warm after, keeps them from coming back. But sometimes the greenhouse asks for one you don't know. A stranger and you have to log it anyway. She looked up at me. Those are the hard ones, because you log the name and then you read in the paper a few days later that they've died. Someone you never met, and you know it was you that logged them. She folded her hands. My mother told me the family ones don't count against you. They were going anyway. But the strangers, the ones the greenhouse asks for that aren't yours, those count. You carry those. She was quiet for a moment. I've only had to log 4 strangers in 50 years. I remember every one. I left that conversation, and I sat in my car in the driveway for an hour. Because here is the thing, the explanation could no longer fully hold. The family names, the neighbors, the friends, all of that I could account for. A declining woman keeping a death list of the people she'd known, anticipating deaths the whole street saw coming. That was sad, but ordinary. But the strangers, names she didn't know, that she claimed she'd logged when the greenhouse asked, days before those people died. If that were true, even once, it broke everything. And if it weren't true, then what was a stranger's name doing in a notebook 2 years old, dated, marked by a woman who said she'd never met them? I had the name. The one from 2 years ago. I'd written it down in the notebook. And I sat in my car, and I did the thing I'd been refusing to do all winter. The line I'd told myself I wouldn't cross. Because crossing it meant treating the notebook as real. And I searched the name on my phone. A name plus the town. And I'm not going to tell you yet exactly what I found, because I need to tell it in order, the way it happened. But I'll tell you that I found an obituary, and the date of death was 4 days after the date in my mother's notebook, and the photograph was of a man I had never seen in my life. And at the bottom of the obituary, among the list of those who preceded him and those who survived him, was a detail that made me put the phone face down on the passenger seat and sit very still in the cold car with the engine off, looking at my mother's open back door across the garden, the thin breath of warmth coming off the greenhouse, into the freezing dark, and the single light on in the kitchen where she was waiting for me to come in and make her supper, and tell her, the way I did every night now, that yes, the greenhouse was warm, and yes, I'd keep it that way. The detail at the bottom of the obituary was the address. Among the survivors, a sister, and the sister's address was listed the way they sometimes are in those small-town notices. And it was a street I knew, because it was 2 streets over from Fern Hollow Road. The man I'd never seen in my life, the stranger my mother had logged 2 years before I moved home, had a sister who lived close enough that my mother could have walked to her house in 15 minutes. So I sat in the car, and I built the explanation. Because that's what I do. That's the thing about me that I've come to understand, is not a strength. My mother knew my sister. Through the sister, she'd heard of the brother, heard he was failing. And she'd written his name down the way she wrote everyone's name down, anticipating, and marked him stranger because she'd never personally met him, though she knew of him. It was held. It held the way all of them held. It required only that I assume my mother had a connection I couldn't verify, and I couldn't disprove that. And so the wall stood. But I noticed, building it, that I'd gotten faster at building. The first wall, the open door, had taken me days to construct, and I'd believed it completely. This one I built in 20 minutes, and I didn't believe it at all. I just put it up because the alternative was to sit in a cold car and accept that my mother's notebook predicted the deaths of strangers. And I wasn't ready to live in that house. So I built the wall knowing it was a wall, which is a different thing from believing it. And I think that's the moment I actually became part of it. The moment I started lying to myself on purpose instead of by accident. I went inside and made my mother her supper. soft food she could manage. And she asked me if the greenhouse was warm, and I said it was. And then she said something she'd never said before. She said, "It's getting restless. Have you felt it? It's been pulling at the door these last few days. I'm going to ask soon." And she looked at me, and there was the clarity, and she said, "You'll have to do it this time. My hand's no good anymore." She held up her hand, which shook, which couldn't hold a pen steady, which was true. The disease had taken her handwriting months ago. The notebook entries had stopped being legible. "When it asks, you log the name. I'll tell you how to know." I told her I would, the way I told her everything, to settle her. But that night, I went out to the garden before bed, and she was right. The warmth coming off the greenhouse was different. All winter, it had been a steady exhale, the same thin breath of heat through the open door. That night, it came in pulses. I stood in the thawed ring of grass and felt it push against me and ease and push again, like breathing that had gotten quicker. And the heat was pulling, that's the only word, pulling toward the open door of the house, toward the kitchen, toward us. The way warm air doesn't move. Warm air rises. It doesn't reach across a cold garden toward a doorway. I went in and shut our back door, the house door, just to break the line of it. And within an hour my mother was up, distressed, scrabbling at the bolt, and I opened it again, and the pulsing warmth came back in across the garden. And she calmed. And I understood that I'd been wrong all winter about what the open door was for. I'd thought it kept the greenhouse warm. Let me think of it as a vent. But the greenhouse made its own warmth out of nothing. The open door wasn't for the heat to get out. It was for the greenhouse to reach in. I called my sister the next day. I wanted on the record that I tried, once, to do the normal thing. I called her, and I tried to talk about the notebook, the names, the dates, the strangers. And I heard myself doing it, heard how it sounded. A man 2 months into caretaking a parent with a degenerative brain disease, isolated in their childhood home, talking about a magic greenhouse that predicts deaths. My sister was kind about it, which was worse than if she'd been dismissive. She got quiet and careful, and she said, "You've been out there alone a long time." It's a lot taking care of her. The mind plays tricks when you're under that kind of strain and you're absorbing all her stuff, all her confusion. It bleeds into you. She offered to come take a weekend so I could get away. She offered to look into more help, a service, someone to give me breaks. She was talking about me. She'd heard her brother describe a haunted greenhouse and concluded, reasonably, lovingly, that her brother was cracking under the weight. And she was right that I was underweight. And she was right that the mind plays tricks. And her being reasonable and loving and completely wrong taught me the last thing I needed to know about why 3 generations of women had carried this alone. You can't tell anyone. Not because of a rule. Because the moment you say it out loud, the most loving people in your life will conclude that you're the one who's sick. And they'll be trying to help you while it goes right on doing what it does. The thing didn't need to threaten me into silence. The world did that for it. The greenhouse asked 9 days later. I know it was 9 days because I'd started, despite myself, keeping track, making my own small entries. Not in the notebook, I wouldn't touch the notebook, but in the Notes app on my phone. Dates and temperatures, the way you'd track anything you were trying to convince yourself was natural. On the 9th day of the pulsing, I woke before dawn, and the house was hot. Not the garden, the house. The kitchen, the hallway, my room. The warmth had come all the way in through the open door and filled the downstairs like a held breath. close and damp and green-smelling, the smell I remembered from being a boy in that greenhouse when it was alive. Wet soil and growing things, a smell that had no business in a January house. And my mother was at the kitchen table in her nightgown, sitting very straight, more present than I'd seen her in weeks. And the marbled notebook was open in front of her, and a pen was lying on it. And she said without turning around, "It's asking. Come and log the name." I asked her how she knew it was asking, and she said, "Listen." And I listened. And under the tick of the house and the wind, I heard it. From out in the garden, through the open door, a sound I'd been half listening for all winter and telling myself wasn't there. It wasn't a voice. I want to be accurate. It was the sound the greenhouse made when it breathed, the pulse of warm air. But it had taken on a shape, a rhythm with edges, 3 beats and a pause, 3 beats and a pause, like a word being pushed out by something that didn't have a mouth. The same almost word over and over. And my mother said, "It's giving you the name. You have to listen until it's clear. It always gets clear. Then you write it." She slid the notebook toward the empty chair. "Sit down. I can't hold the pen. It has to be you now." I did not sit down. That was the one good thing I did, the only clean refusal in this whole account. And I've held on to it the way you hold on to one decent thing in a sea of bad ones. I did not sit down, and I did not pick up the pen. I told my mother no. I told her it was the disease, that there was no greenhouse asking anything, that we were going to close the door and turn on the lights, and I was going to make coffee, and in the morning I was going to call the service my sister found and get us some help. I closed the back door. I bolted it. I turned on every light in the kitchen. And my mother looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on her. Not my whole life. Not even when my father died. A look of pure animal fear. And she said very quietly, "If you don't log the name, it doesn't go away. It just doesn't get the one it asked for. It takes the nearest one instead. It takes whoever's warmest. Do you understand me? You have to give it the name it wants, or it takes from the house." And I said, "That's the disease talking, Mom." And I made the coffee. She didn't sleep. She sat at the table by the bolted door all night. And the house stayed hot. And the green smell got thicker. And around 4 in the morning, the pulsing against the door got hard enough that the door moved in its frame, the old wood creaking against the bolt. And my mother started to cry, not loudly, just steadily, tears running down while she stared at the notebook, and she said over and over, "It's nearest to me. It's nearest to me. I'm the warmest. Please log the name, please." And I held her hand and told her it was all right, and that there was nothing out there. And I believed about 60% of what I was saying, which is the most honest number I can give you. She died at 4:47 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at the stove clock when her hand went loose in mine. There was no struggle, no sound, nothing the disease or her heart or her age couldn't account for. And the doctor who came later said it was her heart, that it was peaceful, that at her stage and her age, it was a mercy. And all of that is true, and I have the death certificate that says so. She died of natural causes in her own kitchen with her son holding her hand. That's what happened. That's also what the greenhouse did. Both of those are the same set of facts, and I have never been able to pull them apart. And I think that's exactly the point. I think that's how it's always worked. The deaths are always real deaths with real causes. The greenhouse never does anything you could point to. It just gets the one it asked for. Or if you refuse, it takes whoever's nearest, whoever's warmest. And the warmest thing in that house, at 4 in the morning, was my mother sitting up in fear by the door she'd kept open for 60 years. even now. I can't honestly tell you the greenhouse killed my mother. That's what makes living with it so unbearable. She was old, she was sick, her heart was failing. The doctor had an explanation. The death certificate had an explanation. Every fact lined up exactly the way it should. And yet, I can never forget what happened the night I refused to write the name. The greenhouse never leaves you with proof. Only coincidence, only timing. Only enough doubt to let you survive, because certainty would destroy you. If I knew without question that refusing to write that name killed my mother, I could never have walked back into that house again. Instead, I'm left with two stories. One says my mother died naturally. The other says I let the greenhouse choose for me. I've spent years trying to decide which one is true. I still don't know. Maybe that's exactly how it keeps its keepers alive. The morning after the funeral, the house was cold. Not cold like winter. Cold like a normal house, like any house. The heat gone, the green smell gone. The back door, which I'd left open through all of it, because I couldn't bring myself to be the one who finally closed it, letting in nothing now but ordinary January air. I went out to the greenhouse and put my hand on the glass, and it was cold as the iron, cold as everything, dead. The thawed ring around it had frozen over. Whatever it was had gone quiet. And the worst part, the part I'm most ashamed of, is the relief I felt. I stood there with my hand on the cold glass, and I felt my whole body unclench. Because it was over. Because she was gone. But it was over. Because I'd refused. And the thing had gone cold, and the world had not ended. And I thought it was the disease after all. It was always the disease. The greenhouse was just a ruin and a grieving, confused woman's story. And I let it get into my head out there alone. And now she's at rest, and I can sell this house and leave and never think about any of it again. I believed that for almost 3 weeks. They were good weeks. I grieved my mother cleanly, the way you're supposed to. And I started the work of clearing the house. And I called a realtor. And I felt, for the first time since October, like a man with a future. The 3 notebooks I'd planned to throw away. I want that known too. I gathered them up, my mother's and my grandmother's and the brittle one before that, to put them in the trash with the rest of the dead woman's papers. And I stood over the bin with them in my hand. And I couldn't do it. Not because of any rule. Because they were the last things in 3 women's handwriting, my family's handwriting. And you don't throw your grandmother's handwriting in the trash. So I kept them. I put them in the box with my father's things, the box where I'd first found my mother's. And I told myself I'd decide later. And I drove the realtor around the property, and we agreed on a price. And I felt fine. I felt free. Right up until the night, 3 weeks after the funeral, when I woke up. Because the house was warm. I lay in my childhood bed and I felt the warmth and the green smell, and I thought, no. I refused. It went cold. It's over. I went downstairs and the back door was open. I had closed it. After the funeral, finally, I had closed and bolted the back door. The first time it had been closed in months, because there was no one left to keep it open for. And it was standing open onto the dark garden. And the warmth was pulsing in across the thawed grass, 3 beats and a pause, 3 beats and a pause. And on the kitchen table, where my mother used to sit, the marbled notebook was open. The notebook I'd put in a box in the attic, open on the table, and a pen beside it. I did not put it there. I need to say that as plainly as I can. I had put that notebook in a sealed box in the attic 3 weeks before. I had closed and bolted that door. I was the only person in the house. and the notebook was open on the table, and the door was open to the garden, and the greenhouse was breathing its almost word across the cold dark. 3 beats and a pause, and it was asking. And it had not gone quiet at all. It had only been waiting, the way it must have waited every time a keeper died. For the next one to come downstairs and find the notebook open and understand that the job was theirs now. That it had passed to them not by choice, but by blood and by proximity. By being the one who was there, the one who was warmest, the one who stayed. I want to tell you I refused again. I'd refused before. I knew what refusing cost, but I'd done it once and survived. But here's the thing I understood. Standing in that warm kitchen at 4 a.m, with a pen waiting, when I refused before, it took the nearest one. And the nearest one was my mother. And I could half believe that was her heart. But now, there was no one else in the house. There was no mother sitting by the door. No one warmer than me, no one nearer. If I refused now, and it took the nearest was me. And I am not a brave man. I've been honest with you about everything else, and I'll be honest about this. I stood there, and I did the arithmetic that I think every keeper in my family has done at this exact table. And the arithmetic came out the same for me as it must have for all of them. Which is that a stranger's name, someone I'd never met, someone who was going to die anyway, the way my mother always said, someone whose death I would only ever read about in a notice days later, weighed less than my own life. That's the trade. That's the whole trade, stripped of everything. It was never about money or a job or a building. It was always just this, your life or a name you write in a book. I sat down. I picked up the pen. And I listened to the greenhouse until the almost word got clear, the way my mother said it would. And it did get clear. 3 beats resolving into a name I'd never heard, a stranger's name. And I wrote it in the notebook in my own handwriting. The 4th hand to keep that list. And I wrote the date beside it, and in the margin, because my mother had taught me you mark them so you can carry them honestly, I wrote the word stranger. And the moment the pen lifted off the paper, the pulsing stopped. The warmth steadied into that thin, even breath I'd known all winter, calm now, fed, settled. The green smells softened, and I sat at the table in the quiet, warm house, and I understood that I would not be selling it, that I would be staying at the end of Fern Hollow Road, keeping the back door open and the greenhouse warm, the way my mother had, and her mother, and hers, because the alternative was to refuse. And I had just learned exactly what I was willing to trade to avoid refusing. I read the obituary 4 days later. I'd hoped, the way you hope, that nothing would come, that the name would be nobody, a name I'd invented in a fugue, proof, finally, that it was all in my head. The name came. A woman, the right name, the right town, died 4 days after the date I'd written, of an aneurysm, sudden, no warning, a healthy woman in her 50s who dropped in her own kitchen. Natural causes, fully explicable, a thing that happens. Survived by a husband and 2 grown children, one of whom had written a few lines at the bottom about how their mother lit up every room. And I read those lines, sitting at my mother's table. And I did the thing my mother said you have to do, which is carry it, and I have carried it. That woman is the first name I logged, and I remember everything about the notice, the way my mother remembered her 4. And I understand now that remembering them is the only honesty left available to a person in my position. The only thing that keeps you from becoming someone who writes the names without feeling them. My sister thinks I stayed in the house because I couldn't let go after Mom died. That's the story. And it's a good story. It's even partly true. Grief does make people cling to houses. She visits sometimes with the kids, and she stopped worrying about me because I seem settled now. Calmer than I was that strange winter when I called her babbling about a greenhouse. She thinks I got better. She's relieved. And when she's here, I keep the back door open and I tell her it's for the airflow. The house gets stuffy. And she doesn't notice that the garden's warm in February. Because why would she? Nobody notices. That's the whole secret. You have to already be looking. Once her younger one, my nephew, wandered out toward the greenhouse, and I called him back faster and harder than I meant to. And my sister laughed and said I sounded just like Mom. And I had to go inside for a minute. Because the thing my mother said, that the young ones burn hottest, has stayed with me. And I do not let the children near the open door. And I do not let them be the warmest thing in the house. And I've rearranged my whole life around making sure that the warmest thing in that house, the nearest one, is always me. So that if it ever asks, and I ever someday find the courage to refuse, the one it takes will be the one who deserves it. I haven't found that courage. I want to be honest about where this actually ends. Because the honest ending isn't redemption. The greenhouse has asked twice more since that first night. Both times I sat down and picked up the pen. Both times I told myself the same arithmetic. A stranger, someone going anyway, weighed against my life, against the children's safety, against the simple, unbearable fact that refusing means the nearest one pays. And I have spent 2 years making sure the nearest one is me. And I have discovered each time it asks that I'm not willing to be the nearest one after all. I am exactly as much of a coward as the trade requires. That's the design, I think. It doesn't recruit the brave. It recruits the ones who'll do the arithmetic. And there's one of us in every generation. And the house finds us. And the door opens, whether we open it or not. The notebook is almost full now. More than half the names are written in my handwriting. When these pages run out, I'll buy another notebook, just like my mother did, just like her mother did. Every few months, the greenhouse grows restless. The warmth changes. The air begins to pulse. I sit at my mother's table. I listen. Eventually, the name becomes clear. I write it down. Then everything grows quiet again. That's my life now. Keeping the back door open, keeping the greenhouse warm, waiting for the next name. And every single time, I tell myself exactly what every keeper before me must have whispered after the ink dried. They were going anyway.